Hi out there again, people. Nick Cicada here, talking about a show that I think more people should watch. I've never made a full-on video about this franchise. I did mention it briefly in my old video about Inside Job, a terrible conspiracy-themed Netflix cartoon show. That seems like a lifetime ago at this point, that there was actually a time I cared about a show on Netflix that at this point nobody even remembers. Simpler times, I suppose. Welcome to 2025, everyone. Anyway, I figure it's worth making a full-on video about Kolchak the Night Stalker. Why I like it. It's one of my favorite science fiction shows. Why I think you should watch it. I'm going to give you my pitch for it here and tell you why I think it's such a great program that more people today should be aware of. So this is a recommendation. I recommend Kolchak the Night Stalker, and here's why. So yeah, again, rare instance, I'm talking about something that I actually legitimately like. That's not too often I do that, but every now and again there's something that I figure I should make a video about where I don't just roast the fuck out of it, because I think it does actually carry quite a bit of weight, or is well written, well acted, etc. This is one of those videos. Kolchak the Night Stalker is a fantastic show, and I would recommend it for anyone, but especially if you're a fan of the X-Files. The X-Files, of course, has many influences. I don't particularly hate the X-Files. It's definitely not one of my favorite sci-fi shows, but I do understand why it has its fans, and I respect it a great deal as being in the subgenre of conspiracy fiction. But I would say that Kolchak the Night Stalker is actually more interesting and a better show than the X-Files. That's a hot take, I know, because of course the X-Files ran way longer. Kolchak the Night Stalker is only one season, whereas the X-Files is basically the longest running narrative live-action show on TV or whatever. Not as long as The Simpsons, but very few things are then again. How can Kolchak be better than the X-Files, you might ask? Well, I say its strength is in its succinctness. It doesn't stick around too long. There isn't really a character arc that Kolchak goes on over the course of the entire show. He sort of goes on a narrative arc in the 2 TV movies that preceded the show, but in the show itself, there is very little character development, and it's episodic. It's not serialized like the X-Files is, with Scully and Mulder having their relationship and dynamic and everything progress from the first episode to the last. There's no progression to Kolchak. He's a very static character. But even so, I would say that Kolchak the Night Stalker is ridiculously ahead of its time, and that it does anticipate the trends and the sort of cultural zeitgeist that would herald in a show like the X-Files to become such a cultural phenomenon. Kolchak is absolutely the largest influence on the X-Files. It's basically where the whole concept of conspiracy fiction began, at least as far as the television medium goes. And if the X-Files are emblematic of the conspiracy-type mindset of the 1990s, then Kolchak is the 1970s equivalent. So if you like the X-Files, you will like Kolchak the Night Stalker. It is an extremely similar show. There are a few key differences, however. Probably the biggest difference from the X-Files is that Carl Kolchak, played by Darren McGavin, is not an insider to the system like Scully and Mulder are. He's thoroughly an outsider who is never quite able to piece the puzzle of exactly what's going on together, and in many episodes the government isn't even involved. There's just some kind of paranormal phenomena that society at large wouldn't believe in, because the truth is difficult to accept, and Carl Kolchak is aware of this. So the premise is very different to the X-Files, because the X-Files is all about Scully and Mulder working from the inside of the FBI and having to reconcile their insider status and the fact that they want the public to be aware of what's going on, because it's kind of screwed up how much the government is willing to conceal. And of course, big government comes in the form of the smoking man character. Whereas with Kolchak, there isn't really any form of internal conflict like that on Kolchak's part. He shoots from the hip, he tells it like it is, he doesn't pull any punches, and he's just willing to say what the facts are and what the truth is. And he never even really draws any conclusions that are absolute, even when he's facing something like a fucking werewolf. He'll just present the facts to the viewer and say, well, make your mind up. You might say, well, that's not as interesting. Kolchak doesn't have to grapple with being a government insider and hiding all this shit from people. He doesn't have to reconcile with that conflict in the way that Scully and Mulder do. Well, Kolchak has to deal with an entirely separate conflict in that even though he does his research the best he can, every single episode he tries his best to figure out the mystery, he is perpetually stifled by the newspaper that he works for, which basically shuts all his articles down because he's just too good at his research, and the general public regards Kolchak as kind of a useless crackpot that goes around and annoys people. It's very sad. It's a very futile struggle that Kolchak is engaged in. But it's less intense than the X-Files. It's much more comedic. You feel very bad for Carl Kolchak, but you never feel like anyone really wants to kill him, like the Men in Black are going to come by and zap him with the noisy cricket. He feels much more like a pathetic insect caught in the trap of reality, and he's trying to see his way out as best he can, but he never exactly gets there. Or at least he's never able to really convince the general public of all the crazy shit that he sees and all the wild goings-on. Another plus for Kolchak is that it's one of the most Chicago-feeling shows ever. And Chicago is, of course, a more interesting setting for a story to take place in than the two obvious options, New York or Los Angeles. And as much as I like Men in Black, the New York pandering is a bit annoying. So Kolchak opts for Chicago. So it's very much like the Blues Brothers or any other franchise that takes place in Chicago. What Women Want with Mel Gibson also coincidentally is in Chicago, which I never even noticed the first time I watched it. Kolchak the Night Stalker is one of the most endemically Chicago shows that you'll ever see, and I appreciate the showrunners for taking it in an interesting direction and setting it somewhere that's a little more interesting than either of the coastal cities. So I do like that, and it's a compelling direction, and it absolutely makes use of the setting multiple times over, and Carl Kolchak should be a civic icon up there. I don't know if he is. I have no way of knowing. I've never been to Chicago, but I should hope at the very least that they regard him like Detroit regards RoboCop. I mean, he's a civic institution, you know? Now, obviously, one very interesting thing about Carl Kolchak as a character is, even though he's presented as somewhat of a klutz and not the best or most reliable source of information, he's an aspirational figure, and it's very rare to come across aspirational journalists in media. These days, of course, the science-industrial complex is gearing up, so we have things like STEM, all the heroes that people are shown in popular media are typically scientists and geniuses and out-of-the-box thinkers. This is how we get cults of personality around figures like Elon Musk. But we don't see too many examples of aspirational journalists in modern media, and this is mainly because people have a marked distrust of journalists, even if the journalist is completely independent, works for themselves on their own behalf, and assures you that they have the public's interest in mind. People just don't trust journalists as much as they will trust scientists. And I think, for one, that's kind of embarrassing that the condition of the Fourth Estate in this country has degraded to such a point where we don't trust any journalist, especially not here in Denver, where it seems like all the print media is bought and paid for. I've talked to a lot of people, and they have a very difficult time trusting print media. They'll trust spoken media or word of mouth, but when it comes to print media, nobody knows what's reliable, nobody knows what they can take at face value. because a lot of stuff is sponsored and even more stuff is driven by unannounced money that goes through hidden channels and the like. So journalists are generally considered an extremely seamy bunch that no one takes seriously. Back in the 70s, obviously, the paradigm was somewhat different. Karl Kolchak is presented as an uncoverer of truths and a vanguard of reality. And even if his overseers, the newspaper he works for, won't let him publish certain stories, he really has dignity and integrity and does his best to report on an upcoming story with accuracy and attention to detail. And that's the kind of thing that nobody would take seriously anymore because we live, as they say, in a post-truth world. Back in the 1990s, when the internet first started out as an alternative to print media, as an alternative to radio and newspaper and TV journalism, people assumed that it would usher in a new era of truth, of reliability. People could easily look up facts, consult the facts, understand the facts. And this utopian vision was marred by the reality that when an entire generation grows up on the internet, as Gen Z has, and has access to all the truths of the world, as well as all the falsehoods, but especially the truths, one will become extremely jaded, apathetic, and tuned out to what goes on in the world because it all seems so hopeless. It's a flow of information that I'm not entirely convinced humanity was prepared for, but we looked forward to it with a bright, shining enthusiasm, unaware of the consequences. A generation with access to this level of information, including every single conspiracy that's ever existed, true or not, and every single falsehood, and every single injustice, that's a lot to load one's brain up on, especially at a younger age. So it's very difficult to take journalism seriously anymore, and I really don't think anyone my age does. There's nobody who really thinks they're going to become the next Geraldo Rivera or anything. That's not something anyone wants to be, because we view journalists as these opportunistic parasites who just want to get paid and distort the facts to suit their own biases. Figures like Karl Kolchak, who very clearly don't do that, who is just asking questions and looking for the truth, that sort of figure isn't looked up to anymore. And I think that's a shame. I think if more people were taught to be journalists, I think if journalism was held up to a higher regard, and especially, of course, if journalism wasn't controlled mostly entirely by money, which I don't at all deny. Journalism is very often motivated by money. We'd have better checks and balances for those in power. We'd have more effective means of understanding the world and how it operates. But we don't have those sorts of checks and balances in place because the internet exists and anyone has access to all the information in the world immediately. So the result is that Gen Z is a sort of lost generation with very little imagination, certainly not the level of imagination required to create a fictive series like Kolchak the Night Stalker. If Kolchak the Night Stalker was created today, people would probably be like, "This is misinformation. What? There's a ghost that's on a motorcycle? This isn't real." I mean, we can't just have a fun series about a journalist uncovering weird shit anymore because it's tainted by the afterbirth of the information age, and it's all just ruined. I mean, the concept and the premise is something that could only exist in the 70s. Back then, I'm sure viewers really admired Karl Kolchak as a character who was willing to confront them with the harsh truths and show them what they didn't want to see and face up against the world. But that type of thing just isn't popular anymore. Journalists are treated like dirt. So I can see why Kolchak the Night Stalker is a little more obscure than the X-Files. FBI agents like Scully and Mulder will always be relevant. There will always be government agents, and we've always viewed them with roughly the same level of distrust. But journalists have gone from being extremely reliable bulwarks of truth, even if perhaps they never were to begin with, and this is just an idealized vision that we've had, to being viewed as slimy cockroaches who will do anything for a scoop. And this isn't helped, of course, by the spread of cheap tabloids, paid magazines, like here in Denver, and especially, of course, the internet, which is just full of all sorts of random bullshit where it's very difficult to parse truth from fiction. Nobody really wants to watch a show anymore about a character who uncovers all sorts of wacky shit and is considered crazy, because nobody wants to admit that they're crazy. Nobody wants to consider alternative possibilities and new ideas. And I think if Kolchak came out today, it'd probably be labeled like an alt-right pipeline thing. But goddamn, I love it, because there's nothing even political about it, and it's just a fun sci-fi horror show, and the predecessor to The X-Files, and I think more people should see it. It's a fantastic show. Other advantages, the theme song is great. Carl Kolchak's hat is iconic. It's the same type as mine, incidentally, a straw boater, although his is gray. There aren't too many examples of a straw boater in fiction, but I like this type hat. It's very stylish. And his whole suit in general is iconic. I'm amazed that more people haven't noticed how fashionable Carl Kolchak looks. Darren McGavin's a fantastic actor, like I said. And the series is short. You can probably binge it in a weekend. It's just one season. And it didn't last nearly as long as it should have, considering how ahead of the times it was. And the precedent it set for The X-Files. It's a very influential series that has a lot to bear on the present landscape of science fiction and horror. In fact, one could say it's probably one of the most forward-thinking media properties of the 1970s, in that there weren't too many shows about questioning the establishment at the time in any form. So Kolchak the Night Stalker is really, really interesting, and I would highly recommend it. It's a show that I think any sci-fi or horror fan should watch at least once through, to get an idea of where these common tropes and cliches started out, that were later developed on in shows like X-Files. So yeah, that's my review of Carl Kolchak the Night Stalker. I would give it 9 out of 10. I would give it 10 out of 10 if there were 2 seasons, or Carl Kolchak ever had like a final goodbye, a final conclusion to his story. But there isn't really one. And I think that's a shame, because a lot could be done with the character. There is a lot of potential, but nothing ever really will be done with him, aside from the terrible remake that came out in the 2000s and a couple comic books. But like I said, he never really gets a character arc. He's never really fleshed out in the way Scully and Mulder are. And that's too bad, because he's a pretty darn cool character. Yeah, I like Kolchak the Night Stalker. Good show. That's a show you should watch. I've been Nick Cicada. Until next time, sayonara, suckers.